Hello there, and happy International Women's Day. Today I'll be doing a presentation on witch feminism and its discontents. Before we start, a caveat on the presentation. Witch feminism is kind of a term that I'm kind of loosely using to describe a set of certain kind of theoretical inclinations which certain feminists have. It's not a formal branch of feminism, although certainly some of the theorists that we'll be referencing today are quite central to a lot of people's thinking about feminism. Now to get into the presentation proper, we're going to start talking about the witch trials. The witch trials started during the Middle Ages in the early 13th century in northern Italy. Early criminalization of witchcraft actually affected men and women quite equally, but between 1560 and 1750, the latter phase of the witch trials, 80 to 85% of prosecutions were women. And in Europe between the 13th and 18th centuries, roughly the overall period of the witch trials, the number of witchcraft trials is estimated to range from 100,000 to 120,000 individuals, resulting in 30,000 to 50,000 executions. And a range of estimates exist, and it's actually very hard to know what are specific numbers of people who died from the witch trials, but this is kind of where the estimates range around. And victims of the witch trials tended to be older peasant women. I mean, I want to emphasize that it wasn't exclusively the case. Sometimes other types of women, indeed other types of people in general who aren't even women, were targeted by the witch trials. But they were typically older peasant women, and that is reflected in the stereotypical depiction of witches being older women. Here's an example of one such very famous example of a witch. But yeah, moving on. The witch trials are seen by some as a kind of primordial act of modern patriarchy. Now, what does primordial mean here? Primordial means a thing which predates or initiates a particular phenomenon. So in the case of patriarchy, obviously patriarchy has existed for far longer than even our current use of this specific calendar. So when we're talking about the witch trials, we're talking specifically about it being a primordial act for modern patriarchy, or the modern form of patriarchy. So for some feminists in the 20th century, witch trials represented a generalized attack on the social position of women. Within the subsistence economies of the Middle Ages, women had a relative autonomy over their own bodies and labor. The development of capitalism required the growth of a large population of urban wage laborers as opposed to rural peasants. And this was facilitated through a process called the enclosure of the commons, but also through the disciplining of women to serve the purposes of population growth. Silvia Federici, one of the kind of people who's kind of most associated with this tendency of feminism, if we can call it that, writes in her landmark book Caliban and the Witch that the witch trials helped to construct a, quote, new patriarchal order where women's bodies, their labor, their sexual and reproductive powers were placed under the control of the state and transformed into economic resources. Let's stop here for a bit and just kind of go over some of the terms that are being used here. So we're saying here that the subsistence economies of the Middle Ages gave women a relative autonomy over their own bodies and labor. Obviously, we're not saying that women were completely free in the Middle Ages. Certainly, that's not the case. But when we compare to the type of life that women live under the social relations of capitalism, the feudalism of the Middle Ages, the subsistence economies, did give them a certain relative autonomy over specifically their body and labor when it comes to the sphere of production, because subsistence economies are economies where you work to subsist. Surplus labor, like the surplus product of labor, is exchanged, but commodity exchange, like generalized commodity exchange as we understand it now, was not the dominant form of economy. Work done on the feudal land of the commons was primarily done for subsistence, and then when there was surplus, it would then be given to the landlord, who would extract it as rent or something like that. But you weren't producing stuff primarily to earn a wage, and then that wage would then be used to purchase economies, which you would then use to subsist. So that's kind of the key difference between a subsistence economy and the capitalist economy, capitalist production, where the production of commodities for exchange becomes the dominant form of acquiring the means to subsist, and that people labor for a wage rather than to subsist directly. And enclosure of the commons, by that we mean the process where lands held in common were fenced off and peasants were driven out. So during the Middle Ages, there were some lands that were not the private property of landlords. They were considered held in common. They were known as common lands. And these were lands where people could go on and they could, they could forage and they could do other kinds of things. They could take, quote unquote, the resources from that common land because, yeah, no one owned it. So you can kind of just go into the woods and take some wood if you want to, that kind of thing. But yeah, like the enclosure of the commons was the process in which that land was then privatized, and people who would previously rely on the resources, quote unquote, that were on that land were now no longer able to access those resources. And so the result of that is that these people are no longer able to live off the lands, and they were forced to flee to cities to become wage laborers. So moving on, in 1973, feminist writers Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English publish a book, or I think it's a monograph actually, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. And this monograph proposes the thesis that many witches were persecuted due to their knowledge of pre-modern contraceptive methods. Silvia Federici, again in Caliban the Witch, argues that the nature of the witch trials indicate that the target of the hunt were not socially recognized crimes, but practices previously considered acceptable. What does she mean by this? Well, so the accusations themselves, they tended to refer to events that had long since passed. So you'd accuse someone of being a witch and then you'd use as evidence something that happened maybe 20, 30 years ago. And it would be very kind of vague like that. They would accuse them of like very nefarious things like infanticide, there was also a lot of accusations about things that we call food crimes, so like stealing of food and things like that. And they would then accuse them of stealing this food to do things like kind of satanic rituals with the food and things like that. So these are kind of like very weird and spurious allegations, which Silvia Federici interprets as being evidence of the fact that the true target wasn't that they did all these kind of witchcraft things, but that they had done something which under a new social order was now no longer considered acceptable. So there was a kind of need to invent, quote unquote, ways of like punishing them for these practices, right? And that's why also it tended to be older women, because these older women were people who were used to the previous normative social order. And yeah, they're kind of the first ones who have to be made to pay for that. Now, I should clarify also that this thesis that Barbara and Deirdre wrote, they propose that many of the persecuted witches were midwives. And while it is true that midwifery as a practice declined in this period in favor of modern medical establishments, there is no real evidence that midwives were particularly persecuted or persecuted at a higher rate than other types of women. The forms of contraception which existed then were typically herbs or other types of home remedies that were passed down from generation to generation. And while with the emergence of the capitalist system, women could no longer be trusted with control over their own bodies, as biological reproduction became a matter in service of capital accumulation. Now, Silvia Federici writes about this in quite a lot of detail because she talks about the development of kind of the science of population growth and how population growth became associated with economic growth. And so if that's the case, then obviously things like contraception become a barrier to economic growth and national wealth. And so there's a kind of need to kind of make this into a matter of public administration more so than kind of something which is the choice of individual women or even families. And as mentioned, midwives gave way to the male doctor, and having children and natalism came to be seen, as I said, a source of wealth and economic growth for society. And we can still see like the remnants of this idea, right? When we look back over phrases, phrases which aren't particularly common nowadays, I think, but like some of you maybe have heard of the concept of lie back and think of England. This specific kind of thing became even a meme format in I think the 2010s. And so lie back and think of England literally is the idea of like, if you do not want to have sex with your husband, you should do so anyway, and kind of try to imagine that you're doing some kind of national duty and that your individual choice in the matter is kind of secondary to that national duty. Moving on to the concept of the patriarchy of the wage. With the enclosure of the common lands that women relied on for subsistence, women had to resort to wage labor. However, they often faced discrimination in attempting to find work. And around this time, prostitution and vagrancy also began to face strict penalties. I think things like prostitution previously did have punishments, but there's something about the way in which, again, as Federici talks about the kind of development of modern public administration, certain crimes became punished much more severely in a way that was much more efficient than was possible in the Middle Ages, or the early Middle Ages. But yeah, these crimes began to face strict penalties, and so women were increasingly restricted to the role of housewife, because they weren't able to earn money, which was now becoming the dominant form of getting social power, and social power is obviously also what gives you the means of subsistence. And so yeah, women were increasingly not able to access that on their own independently, and so they had to rely on male figures in their life, and especially husbands, and so were restricted to the role of housewife. Where labor performed by women was seen as women's natural domain. This was kind of the ideological shift that came along with it. The labor performed by women is inherently women's work, and so it shouldn't be compensated financially. And while men's work outside the house was compensated financially, giving them a relative source of social power over women. Sometimes this was like very blatantly discriminatory if we look at it from like a modern point of view, right? Because you could maybe have a woman doing like work producing textiles, and a man might do that work in a factory and he would be compensated for it. But if a woman did a similar type of work in the home, this was seen as quote unquote women's work and just kind of her natural domain, and it's not something which should give you a salary. So that's to say that in the Middle Ages, for some women could previously have an independent living working on common lands. And because of the development of private property and capitalist social relations, this was now increasingly no longer possible. And it's this kind of degradation of women's work and denial of like a wage is what Silvia Federici calls the patriarchy of the wage. So I've already covered that point. I forgot I included it on the thing. But moving on, we're now going to go to some of the more we're going to stop talking about the Middle Ages, and we're going to talk about the witch as a feminist icon. Now, Margaret Murray wrote a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe in 1921, and in this book she hypothesized that witch trials were a way of suppressing a pagan religion worshipping Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is a horn god supposedly worshipped by these witches. I think I didn't include a picture of it because I thought it was creepy. But yeah, and then it's a kind of paganist religion, and modern paganist religions such as Wicca, which if you know at all anything about these kind of like witch feminism things, you've probably heard of Wicca. It's a pagan religion and a kind of modernization of this kind of hypothesis that Margaret Murray was proposing. And yeah, Wicca is based on pagan pre-Christian beliefs and follows three main tenets: magic, respect for nature, and worship of the goddess. And today, Wicca is considered a form of modern witchcraft as it involves performing magical rituals alongside its worship rituals. And I think Margaret, like the point of this hypothesis also was to kind of say that like these women who were persecuted by the witch trials, maybe they really were witches and maybe they really did have magical powers, and that's why the patriarchy had to do the witch trials, because actually women are really powerful and have these like energies which they can tap into, and the patriarchy feared it and needed to wipe them out. And so now not everyone really believes that, right? Modern Wiccans don't really necessarily believe that. Maybe some do, but you know, it's more of an idea, right? It's this idea of women as being inherently powerful, right? And so as a result of that, the witch is reinterpreted in the modern era as being an embodiment of self-actualization and self-empowerment, because it's it's a force that women can draw on, that is capable of overcoming patriarchal power, right? And related to this, women are seen as having an innately strong connection to nature and the natural world. And femininity, which was once seen as soft and demonized, is now seen as a unique power, like I said, that women can draw on to empower themselves, right? Yeah, so you can even see that now also with like kind of modern ideas of like the mother nature idea, and now in like the really modern era, we're talking about like 2020s internet culture. You have things like feminine energy and like how to tap into your feminine energy and things like that, and those, being able to do that would then give you like kind of a positive way of navigating the world as a woman. Now we're gonna take a moment here. Do any of you guys find these ideas maybe a little weird? And that's fine, by the way, if you think it's weird. I think it's a little weird, right? I'm, like I said, I'm a feminist. I'm very like sympathetic to these ideas, but I think they're a little weird. So we're gonna go move on into some criticisms of witch feminism. So one of the first criticisms is that these ideas reinforce certain regressive stereotypes about women, which is that women are irrational. Witch feminism accepts irrational, quote unquote, irrational knowledge as being valid and also uniquely the terrain of women. And I use scare quotes on irrational because I don't want to make it sound as if like these ideas are stupid, right? I'm not saying these ideas are stupid. What I'm saying is that the way in which these ideas gain truthhood to the people who accept them as true is that there's a kind of ethereal spiritual knowledge here, and it's not held to the same standards of quote unquote scientific rigor. That basically, it's to say that you can't publish this in a medical journal, right, or in a scientific journal, these ideas about feminine energy and things like that, right? So they're not seen as scientific, but they may be seen as true, right? And so they're irrational in the sense of the methodology in which of how you acquire this knowledge, right? But that doesn't mean that it is inherently wrong. But for more empirically minded people, obviously this is kind of a non-starter, the fact that these ideas are kind of ethereal and just kind of floating in the world for certain people to tap into, and you can't kind of scientifically test it using some kind of rigorous methodology. Another criticism of witch feminism is that it has a kind of fetishization of nature. And I think for some people who criticize this thing, they see nature as being a fixed state that is not subject to change, There's a kind of aversion to modern medicine which comes from this, right? Because they prefer natural forms of healing. So, you think about like the way in which people use crystals and essential oils and things like that as forms of like homeopathic therapy, as an alternative and maybe even as a complete replacement to traditional forms of medicine. This is what is being criticized, right? Because it leads to things like people not using modern cancer treatments and using only homeopathic therapies. It leads to things like vaccine skepticism, which, as we know from the pandemic in the last 5 years, is deeply, deeply dangerous. I think also we should say that before we move on to biocentrism, that nature shouldn't be like uncritically accepted as something real, right? I think is where like these criticisms come from as well, is that it is, when something is referred to as natural, it's often the product of man-made interventions. What we call natural is not necessarily like natural. It is still the product of a world in which humans are in and are a natural part of, and so nature there shouldn't be this kind of dualism, you could say an artificial dualism between mankind and nature. So moving on to bioessentialism. This fixation on women's power being rooted in like womanhood and usually typically biological womanhood and divine femininity is almost certainly transphobic. Divine femininity and related concepts which see the essence of womanhood as being beyond secular understanding, I think I don't think I should even really have to go into it too deeply of like why this is transphobic, because it's yeah, you're kind of saying that certain people are women and that this is decided on a kind of spiritual plane, which the human world cannot possibly understand, and so we have to kind of just accept it. And yeah, that's kind of inherently kind of a kind of conservative way of thinking about these things, right? Is that certain things are beyond human comprehension, and so we shouldn't try to comprehend it, and we should just accept the kind of natural order of things. Okay, moving on. We have a title slide which is going to seem confusing, but I promise you we'll get into it and I'll explain it fully. The witch versus the cyborg. What is the feminist subject? So these issues, call attention to a central tension within radical and socialist feminisms. And this tension can be exemplified by asking what exactly the feminist political subject looks like. And if you're unfamiliar with the term political subject, the best way I can think of explaining it is it's the main character of the story of a social struggle, right? Like feminism is a social struggle, and we're trying to imagine who is the main character. If feminism is a movie, what does the main character look like in the feminism movie, right? A political subject is a conscious person with unique experiences, perceptions, and goals. Or in other words, to put it really simply, who does feminism speak for? What kind of person does feminism speak for? So for some people, on the one hand, the feminist subject is seen as the witch, and on the other, it is the cyborg. So let's talk a bit about the witch. Witch feminism's emphasis on the body as the primary site of women's oppression produces within it a tendency to be skeptical of medical technology and an embrace of the natural, like we discussed before. This is supported, obviously, like this view makes sense because it's supported by the real history of medical oppression and the continued discrimination that women face in healthcare. You think about things like certain healthcare treatments, like not taking in fully the specificities of women's bodies and the ways in which those healthcare plans interact with women's bodies. You think about the fact that like a lot of women find it difficult to be treated by doctors because their pain is not taken seriously, and so it leads to kind of unideal forms of medical plans because of this kind of unconscious discrimination. And so as a result of this distrust of the medical establishment, and like I said, there is good reason why there should be at least some level of mistrust in the medical establishment. As a result of it, they have an inherent mistrust of body modification, seeing it as a profit-seeking ploy and a continuation of patriarchal control over the body. In contrast, cyborg feminism sees the natural as being the creation of patriarchal discourses, with social relations being the primary site of gendered oppression. So to maybe kind of try and put that in a more one sentence way, witch feminism, the witch figure, is a vision of a feminist future where women are able to overthrow patriarchal control over bodies by re-establishing the body's natural connection to nature, right? And foregoing all attempts to remake the body, because attempts to remake the body actually are ways of making women accountable to the ends of patriarchal capitalism, right? It's remaking the body for the purposes of patriarchal capitalism to make a more productive, better body for the purposes of the accumulation of profit for the capitalist class. I just want to also do a little interlude here, because I think this idea that this idea of body modification and kind of trans-affirming care surgeries as being inherently a form of patriarchal control over bodies is kind of missing something, because Sean Fay discusses in this book actually. Sean Fay discusses how trans people face considerable bureaucratic obstacles in trying to access gender-affirming care. And far from it being a for-profit industry which sees trans people as consumers, the industry represents patriarchal power over trans bodies precisely through the arbitrary denial of gender-affirming care to trans people, right? Trans people have to jump through a large number of hoops to be able to prove their transhood, and as a result of that, it is still domination over their bodily autonomy, just in a kind of different way than how which feminists imagine what patriarchal domination over the body looks like. And actually, this should produce a natural common cause against patriarchal bureaucracy, but which feminists are often unable to see this nuance and instead condemning the use of medical technologies for trans care on a conceptual level rather than kind of seeing like what is the lived reality of people who are subordinate to these power structures, right? So now we're going to talk about the cyborg. Cyborg feminism originates from Donna Haraway's book, A Cyborg Manifesto. This feminist tendency seeks to reject essentialisms, and it imagines a political subject which is, quote, cyborg, right? And that's kind of maybe very sci-fi, and like there's a reason for that, right? Because the point of this term is to kind of talk about how the political subject is one which is made up of various composite identities and free to choose its identities, affinities, and kinships, right? It is not a woman as constructed by like some discourse, but it is a person with agency who is then able to choose how they identify and how they associate with other people. It has similarities to xenofeminism, which is also a branch of feminism that rejects naturalism and seeks the abolition of gender. And so basically the point of this, right, is that it sees human agency and capacity to self-determine as the basis of solidarity and the struggle for social emancipation, right? Again, to kind of say like a quick summary of what is really kind of the tension point between this so-called witch feminism and so-called cyborg feminism, right? I said that cyborg feminism sees social relations as being the site of women's oppression. And like what I mean by that is that it's not the body's inherent nature that is being subverted, but that the agency of people is being violated by the enforcing of undesirable ways of living, right? It's not about, for witch feminism, they're seeing the body's natural course as being subverted, and this is the problem with patriarchy and patriarchal capitalism. Again, to put it simply, witch feminism sees capitalism, patriarchy, as imposing an unnatural script on how we should live, which perverts the natural script of our bodies, whereas cyborg feminism is questioning even this notion of script, right? They're saying all social scripts are artificial, and the only thing that is real is human agency. I do want to also clarify here, right? It's not a denial of biological reality. Cyborg feminism obviously is aware of this thing, quote unquote, called biological and scientific reality, but it's also trying to be sensitive to the fact that what we consider, what we hold to be biologically and scientifically true is not always true because it is actually empirically and scientifically proven, but because there are ideological discourses and ideological notions and presuppositions which are made to be true, right? We accept them to be true even though they are not really true in an empirical scientific sense, right? They are, to use a social science term, they are normatively true. So this brings us to my final point. A feminism beyond the category of women. Now this is a very long quote. I'm aware it's a very long quote, but it's just really good, so I kind of had to quote the whole thing. So we're gonna try and unpack this quote, but we're gonna read it out first. So Judith Butler says, "Is the construction of the category of women as a coherent and stable subject an unwitting regulation and reification of gender relations? And is not such a reification precisely contrary to feminist aims? To what extent does the category of women achieve stability and coherence only in the context of the heterosexual matrix? If a stable notion of gender no longer proves to be the foundational premise of feminist politics, perhaps a new sort of feminist politics is now desirable to contest the very reifications of gender and identity, one that will take the variable construction of identity as both a methodological and normative prerequisite, if not a political goal." Okay, a lot to unpack here. Judith Butler is not saying women are no longer useful as a category of analysis. What they are saying is that instead, feminism is defined by protecting the rights of women to be women. But is it not fair to ask whether our very idea of quote unquote womanhood has been created by the very patriarchy which feminism aims to overthrow? And if so, if this category of womanhood is one which we find to actually limit us more than it allows us to be free and to be liberated, then is it not the case that there should be a new basis of what we call feminist politics, right? That the feminist subject being free to adopt whatever form of identity and being it so chooses, rather than being prescribed one by existing discourses and appeals to nature, is something which is more politically and socially useful for us at this point in time. What does reification mean? Reification is the making of subjective truths. I mean, to put it simply, there's way more complicated ways of explaining this, but to put it simply, it is the making of subjective truths into objective reality. So we might say something is subjectively true. It is a form of conceiving reality which makes sense to us at the present moment in time. But then from there is a jump to then say it is the only rational way to interpret reality. And that is a much higher claim to make, and one which some of these truths actually don't have the means of making that higher claim. And yet we live in a society which forces us to accept that higher claim anyway. So the reification of gender relations and the reification of gender is the idea that, yeah, certain things about what we associate with womanhood or even manhood are things which make sense within this current society that we exist in, but are not necessarily true in a kind of like long-term view of history and long-term view of all the infinite possibilities of human life. And so why should we pretend that they are true for all possible infinite realities of human life? And so, and this is why I think, to bring it back to be about me, is that I started this off by saying at a certain point that I am a feminist. What I say to people often when I get into longer, more intricate conversation with them is that I'm not identifying as a feminist because I think like it is morally correct to be a feminist. I identify as a feminist because I feel an investment in feminism as a political project, right? It is a project which I feel has within it the ability to imagine horizons which are better for our world, better for me, better for all the people around me, not just the women in my life or the women that we all might encounter in our lives, but there is something in feminism for you and me, regardless of who you or regardless of who I am, right? It is a flexible philosophy which allows us to imagine a political subject that can be truly human in all the infinite ways that what it could mean to be human. And that's what I find interesting about these ideas. I hope you found that interesting. I hope I explained it well. I know I stuttered a lot. Hopefully my edits would take some of that away. But again, happy International Women's Day.